Thank you to all who have come on this Memorial Day weekend and who have led and participated in worship so far. I guess I'll say for myself, when I first heard about the Uvalde tragedy earlier in the week, I was horrified. I was sickened. And my first instinct was to say, well, maybe we need to just kind of throw out the plan for this week and talking about Hebrews and reflect on this massacre. And that would have been fine. It's not like we have some sacred duty to stick to the sermon series that are proposed here. But I'm not sure what I would have said. What happened was unspeakably evil. It is frustrating beyond belief that we just keep seeing this happen over and over again in our society. And you all know that, and I know that, and it's good to sit together and lament. But I'm not sure what word of encouragement to offer about that. But then I remembered that Hebrews was actually written for a people who were suffering, for people who were oppressed, for people who lived in fear. And so all of these really heavy topics, these abstract subjects that we've engaged so far, things like the divinity of Christ, the humanity of Christ, the priesthood of Christ, these were actually offered in order to provide a source of hope and guidance for those who were suffering, to boost their confidence in our Savior who was fully God, fully human, and who mediates for us. And so, with some fear and trembling, I've decided to move forward with the scheduled plan and to discuss what might be the most difficult topic that Hebrew addresses, the subject of atonement through the blood of Christ, in the hope that somehow, as we reflect on these topics and we remember God's love, this might give us more confidence and hope in Christ too. Now, when I say that the subject of atonement is difficult, I mean this on several different levels. First, it is a difficult subject in the sense that it is just hard, if not impossible, for us to wrap our minds around it. You see, Christians believe there is a primal connection that exists between evil and death. Death isn't just something that happens for us. It's not just a fact of existence. Death itself is a tragedy. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to be a part of God's creation. And furthermore, we have come to believe that somehow, in a way that even preceded humanity, sin or evil inserted a kind of wedge in the relationship between God and creation, and that death was a result of this. This is something that the Bible talks about in grand and sometimes abstract terms. Here's how Paul describes it in Romans. He says, "Sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin. And so death spread to all because all have sinned." So death wasn't supposed to be a part of creation, but now it is here, and not only is it here, but it is everywhere. It seems to be the dominant force in creation. It is our cruel tyrant and our inescapable jailer. Well, maybe inescapable isn't quite the right word, because there are a few examples of people in the Bible who did seem to escape death. Many of these are stories that are very strange and that provoke lots of discussion. Things like Elijah's chariot ride to heaven, whatever that involved, or Enoch's mysterious disappearance in Genesis, or even the resurrections in the New Testament of people such as Lazarus and Dorcas and Eutychus. It's possible that we could say that these individuals cheated death because they escaped the fate that nearly 100% of humanity has had to face. But we can't quite say that they defeated death, because their success, their freedom, didn't extend to anybody else. Death continued to dominate the rest of humanity after these individuals escaped it, just as it had done before. But in Jesus' case, things were different. Because when Jesus rose from the dead, not only did he join this very, very small club of people who escaped death and lived to talk about it, but it went further than others. He didn't just cheat death, he defeated it. He changed the game for all of us. Christians believe that with Jesus' death and resurrection, sin has been defeated, death has been conquered, and there is now life available for all. But when you try to kind of sort behind this language and you say, wait, what does this mean? What are these things actually trying to say? That's when we get back into this part that's kind of beyond our comprehension, right? The New Testament affirms it again and again, but it requires metaphorical language to try to communicate what it is really that happened. So, for example, sometimes when the New Testament is talking about Jesus' death and resurrection, it will describe Jesus as a liberator who went down and kind of got the keys to Hades when he died and came up victorious so that he can release or liberate those who are in prison by death. In other passages, it describes Jesus as a redeemer, as someone who paid a ransom in order that we might be free from death's imprisonment. And then in other passages, it describes Jesus as a sacrifice, as one who was given up in order that we might be cleansed from sin and therefore freed from the curse, the sickness of death. Now, these are all imperfect metaphors. They describe something that's beyond our understanding. They describe it in part, but they offer kind of helpful insights into it. And it's the last metaphor, the one that describes Jesus as a sacrifice, that we will be studying specifically today. But I think this is also the hardest metaphor, which brings us into the second difficulty, because this is something that almost none of us have experienced. I guess we could do a poll. How many of us have participated in an animal sacrifice ritual? No one. Okay, no one has participated in this before, right? Because the vast majority of people in the world, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, all these different groups of people do not practice animal sacrifice today. There are only a few small communities in the world that still do. And even if you had raised your hand because you had visited one of these communities and you had somehow convinced them to allow you to participate in their sacred religious ritual, then even that wouldn't have been the same thing as the animal sacrifice that we read about in the Bible. Because that was a system that was unique to the Jews, unique to Yahweh, until it stopped occurring nearly 2,000 years ago. You see, it just so happened that Jesus and his followers were basically in the last generation of Jews that participated in the sacrificial system. Jesus' parents participated in it. We know that they offered sacrifices like the law required, animal sacrifices, when he was born. We know that Jesus and Mary and Peter and Paul and all these figures that we read about spent a lot of time in the temple where sacrifices were offered. And presumably, as faithful Jews, offered sacrifices themselves. But shortly after this, just a few decades after Jesus rose from the dead, the Romans came through Jerusalem. They destroyed the second temple, and they ended the practice of animal sacrifice for Jewish people forever. And so that not only means that Christians today find this practice weird and hard to understand, but Christians for centuries and centuries have been unfamiliar with this practice. Christians who lived in the medieval times didn't know anything about animal sacrifice. Christians who lived in the year 300 AD didn't know about animal sacrifice. They knew about it, they read about it, but they hadn't experienced it directly. And if any of us have ever been in a situation where you have a communication with a friend or a family member, maybe in a text or on email, when something got miscommunicated, maybe you misread the tone, you didn't understand the context, something was going on, you know how easy it can be to misinterpret things that we aren't experiencing directly. And if it's easy for us to misinterpret something from a friend or loved one just through a text, it's very easy for us to misinterpret the meanings and purposes of an ancient ritual that hasn't been practiced in nearly 2,000 years. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean we can't study it. It just means that we should approach it with some humility. And then the third thing and final thing that I wanted to say that makes this a difficult topic to study is that these passages have been used in ways that have caused people harm. This is something that's become especially clear in recent decades. 33 years ago, there were two feminist scholars who wrote an influential essay called "For God So Loved the World," with a question mark at the end of it. And in it, they argued that Christian atonement theology has contributed to women being oppressed in Western society. Now, how does that work, you ask? Well, let's take what's the most perhaps popular understanding of how the atonement works to kind of break this down. This is called penal substitution. This is what I was taught when I was growing up, is that the justice of God requires that every sin must be punished with death and hell. And so every human being who has ever lived except Jesus has sinned and therefore experiences that and therefore deserves that punishment. But when Jesus came, he lived a perfect life. He was innocent. He never sinned himself. And therefore, he offered to take the place for us. And it was actually because of his innocence that he could take on this suffering. And God accepted it. That in this arrangement, God's wrath or the requirements for people to be punished for wrongdoing was satisfied, and humans were saved at the same time. Now, there is something very powerful about this story. There's something about the way that it communicates Jesus' love for us and God's commitment to both mercy and justice that I can affirm. But it does kind of raise some questions at the same time, things that have been concerned. It's not primarily about Jesus' action, but primarily about God. Like, why would God make this rule that every sin had to be punished with death and hell? If God is all-powerful, couldn't God just forgive people and be done with it? Or if God was so committed to justice, why would God allow Jesus to suffer for something he didn't do? That doesn't seem particularly just. And the feminists that I mentioned earlier, Brown and Parker, who explored this, these questions are in the back of their mind, but their concern was less with the problems of how this works and more concerned with the effects that this atonement theology has on people. You see, they argued that female Christians are more inclined to accept mistreatment and abuse because they're told to model after Jesus, who himself accepted mistreatment and abuse as something that was holy and good. Now you think, why female Christians, right? Like, this should apply just as much to men and women. But the problem is that we live in a society that for many years has been hierarchical, in which men have positioned themselves as being above women. And so it often happens that even unconsciously, men tend to think of themselves as being in the position of God the Father, and women as being in the position of Jesus. And so women are asked, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through cultural pressures, to embrace innocent suffering for the sake of the greater purposes that men have in mind. This is how they describe some of this in their essay. They said, "Our acculturation to abuse leads us to keep silent for years about experiences of sexual abuse, to not report rape, to stay in marriages in which we are battered, to give up creative efforts, to expend all our energy in support of other lives and never in support of our own, to accept it when a man interrupts us, to punish ourselves if we are successful, to deny so habitually our right to self-determination that we do not feel we have an identity unless it is given to us by someone else." It's striking to me that this was written in 1989, when it feels like it could have been written right at the beginning of the Me Too movement in 2017. This is something that women experience. And these females are not the only ones who have suggested that this atonement theology has communicated this. There have been other theologians, African American theologians, and womanist theologians, and liberation theologians who have said, yes, when we've heard this idea that God demands punishment and wants Jesus to suffer even though he's innocent, we've had other oppressors in our lives say that you should do that too. That slaves shouldn't complain even if they're oppressed because Jesus didn't complain when he suffered. That people in other parts of the world should deal with their suffering because there is a greater mission or a greater good being accomplished. I think that there is some validity in this criticism. When you have enough people who are raising their voices and saying, yes, this applies to me, this resonates with my experience, I think you have to listen to it. But I think that there's still an open question about whether the problem is with the actual biblical passages, the actual model of sacrifice, or with the way that it has been interpreted. Because I want us to remember, again, that this practice of animal sacrifice hasn't been occurring for thousands of years, and so it's possible that these oppressions that have undoubtedly been brewing for a long time are coming out of misunderstandings of what the Bible's saying and not from the text itself. So I want to, just for a few minutes, kind of dig into this a bit deeper. Starting in Hebrews 9:11. Hebrews says, "But when Christ came as a high priest of the good things that have come, then went through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. For the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of ashes of a heifer sanctify those who have been defiled, so that their flesh is purified. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God." Sorry, I memorized this passage in a different translation years ago, and it's stumble when I've got these two things competing in my head. The first thing that I would point out about this scripture is that it doesn't actually say anything about punishment. There's no reference to sins needing to be punished, the wrath of God, hell, or damnation, or anything like that. I think punishment is one of the things that we as later Christian readers impose onto these sacrificial things. Instead, the emphasis of this passage is on purity, right? So when we think about what was happening when there were sacrifices being offered, maybe our assumption is to say that yes, God was mad with the Hebrew people for sinning, and so God wanted them to bring in these bulls and goats in order that God could punish them or kill them instead of killing the people. But that's not what the text actually indicates. Instead, the idea is that the blood of these animals has a cleansing or purifying effect on people who have been corrupted by the disease of sin and death. Now, that might not seem that different, but the key difference is that the killing is not the point. God doesn't take any pleasure or find any redemptive value in killing animals in books like Leviticus. The point is that these animals give us access to their kind of pure life power. Leviticus says in chapter 17 that the life of the flesh is in the blood. And I have given it to you for making atonement for your lives on this altar. For as life, it is the blood that makes atonement. Now, this is strange to us because we're not a culture that puts a lot of emphasis on purity, on moral purity as something that we need to be concerned about. But if we think of it as being something like health, you catch a disease, something's wrong with you, then the metaphor would suggest that you have to have some kind of medicine, some kind of vaccine, something that could purify your body so that you wouldn't continue to be sick. And for the ancient Hebrews, the innocence of life, which is symbolized in the blood of creatures, is that purifying agent. Now, that should actually say Hebrews 10, not Leviticus 10 there. This passage reminds us that that was never fully the case It says, "The law was only a shadow of the things to come, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." But it was symbolic. It was symbolic that we needed some kind of purifying agent in order to be free from this disease of sin. So then when we hear Jesus talking in the New Testament, he says things like this: "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." Now, this is talking about communion. And it's suggesting that whenever we partake in this ritual of communion, we are partaking of Jesus' blood, which is his life essence, his power, his nature as the one who was both fully God and fully human and was able to live without sin. And so then when we look back at this passage, we can see that the blood, the function of the blood, is to purify us as well. It says specifically, how much more can the blood of Christ, more than bulls and goats, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God? Now, I will be quick to acknowledge that I'm still not totally sure what to do with this. I think that because this is such an unfamiliar practice, I don't tend to turn to this metaphor very often. But it is part of the Bible, and it is part of people's experiences. And I think that it's okay to use it if we can remember that it's not that God is celebrating the death of Jesus, but rather we are somehow accessing the life, the living power of Jesus through his blood. But then you say, well, Jesus did have to die in order for this to happen. And yes, I suppose that Jesus' death does play a part of it, but Hebrews addresses that too. Because the way that Hebrews interprets this is by speaking about the temple, the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. And one thing that you have to understand is that God was in the midst of the Jewish community, starting in the time when they were in the wilderness, when God was in the tabernacle, eventually moving to the temple in Jerusalem itself. But God was veiled. There was this sense that not everybody could go to see God because their own mortality, their own sin, this wedge that existed between God and them, could potentially make them die. And so there were boundaries that were drawn so that people could get near to God, but not so close that it was dangerous. This is noted in Chronicles when it says, "Do not let anyone enter the house of the Lord except the priests and ministering Levites. They may enter, for they are holy, but all the other people shall observe the instructions of the Lord." And that's just referring to the outer layer of the temple. Hebrews goes on to explain, these preparations having been made, the priests go continually into the first tent, the outer layer, to carry out their ritual duties, but only the high priest goes into the second. And he but once a year, and not without taking the blood that he offers for himself and for the sins committed unintentionally by the people. So there's this sense that even for priests, they can only get so close. And there's this realm of something that is beyond what humans can handle, that has to be entered in order for there to be mediation between God and humanity. But only one person can do it, and he has to make sure that he's gone through all of the ritual sacrifices so that he is as pure as a human can be. And he only does it once a year. And he wants to make sure that in this way there can be some contact between God and humanity. Well, Hebrews says that when Jesus died, something along those lines happened. That when Christ came as the high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent then he went through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not a part of this creation. That somehow when Jesus died, he was able to enter a realm that is beyond us, the realm of death itself. And when the God human entered this space with the holy life power of Christ, that somehow it changed things for all of us. Now, once again, we are back in this space that is beyond human understanding. I'm not going to try to explain away exactly how this works because I think it is a mystery, and it would be arrogant of me as a human to suggest that I know exactly how it works. But I do think that it changed things. We don't have to, I guess I can look at this passage from Acts, but it suggests that when God raised Jesus, having released him from the agony of death, it was because it was impossible for death to be held in its power. So all this to say that I don't think that it was actually the fact that Jesus was killed, but the fact that he brought his holy life into this most holy place, into this realm of death, that these mysterious things were changed, that somehow the wedge between God and humanity was removed, that somehow the power of death and sin was weakened, that somehow we are able to access God in a more intimate and powerful way than we ever had before. And I think there is a kind of beauty in this. Something that we have, in an effort not to further the harms of hierarchical thinking, avoided. And that is the gratitude that we can have for a God who loves us so much that he was willing to go through this for us. I do not believe that God willed the death of Jesus, that this is about punishment. I think that God sees us suffering and allows us to share in the power of his life, which is symbolized through blood. Now, in our time, in our day, it's true that we do not have sacrificial animal atonements anymore. But we do see violence. We do see suffering. We do have to deal with the reality of blood. And I think it is important to remember that there is a God who wants to suffer with us, who comes and sits next to us, not because the suffering is good, but because his life power is so strong that when we partake of it, we can somehow come out of it whole and healed.